So yes, first of all, to tool us all in that we're talking about the same thing, we all try to engage more and more in experiential learning. So what does that typically mean? Well, we're trying to get people to gain understanding and skill through action. So rather than just be passively listening, to really be taking charge through the whole course and every course meeting. I try to also include real world relevance. And I tell them, this is how this is going to be helpful to you in your career as best as I can. Usually with the work that I do with water, things tend to have a lot of that. I always try to engage their student creativity. Like in science, we often focus on science as a critique of things, but actually science is a creative art form too. You have to create an experiment. So getting them to do that kind of creative work. And then when they're doing creative work, giving them the freedom to fail, as they say. So allowing them to do things trial and error, repeat activities, make corrections on assignments, things like that. And then also asking them to do reflective observation, sometimes by peer grading their students, their friends, and in how they're working together on their team. So this is just generic. This is what we want to do. Now, I've always had the benefit because my job has part of my teaching responsibilities has been to teach field courses about water. So teaching people, rainfall and infiltration and rivers and all that kind of stuff. And I've had 3 different courses over the years where I'm regularly taking students out. We're really lucky in hydrology because we have a high percentage of women in our major. And so we have a lot of diversity that's going on. And I want to get everybody engaged in that physical activity. But in recent years, it's become increasingly challenging to do this, not just because of the pandemic, but before that. And, going back to 2005, and it never has gotten less, it's only getting stronger and stronger, is the movement against low enrollment courses. If I'm taking 20 people out to a river and 30% of those people can't swim, well, I can't have 100 people, right? So I have to, you can only do so much. And yet more and more faculty under pressure to only have classes with 100 to 500 students and things like that. With field work, there's a very high cost of equipment, supplies, and travel. I mean, we're going to places, you need waders, you need boots for everyone of every body type and size, and as well as then all the scientific equipment. So, that's okay. I'll use my research equipment to help with that. There are numerous safety challenges. So obviously, I'm not going to take people to the top of a mountain cliff overlooking a giant waterfalls. We're not going to go out in the middle of a winter snowstorm. However, it's water. I teach my class in the winter because I need students to be in the rain making wet measurements under stormy conditions, but it does require great attention to safety. And then in the last 5 years, this problem of last minute TA allocations, that because we have something called this TACOS formula, I'm not sure if that's campus-wide or just the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences, but our small classes don't meet the formula to get a TA. We're not a lab, we're a field course. And so I have to get a special variance every time with a letter to the highest accountant officials in our college. And so it becomes a huge burden and a major source of anxiety for me. Like, well, what am I going to do if I have an enrollment of 20 and I don't have a TA? So that's been difficult. So even before the pandemic, I've already been trying to think through, what could I do? Can we do something virtually that's a meaningful experiential learning in another way? And there's 2 choices. One choice is to put in a huge amount of effort on your own to create a highly customized virtual setting, where you're just going to do the thing that's necessary for that assignment. And then that means you're going to have to do a deep dive into coding. You're going to have to develop art skills and all kind of, how do you build a graphical user interface and work with controllers and all that kind of stuff. Or seeking more of a path of least resistance, if there already are extraordinarily high quality virtual settings, and I'll explain what AAA means, but if they already exist, is it possible to bend those to our needs though then accepting the problems inherent in those realms. Over the years, I have seen a lot of efforts around the world in engineering, in science, to try to build custom settings. And my opinion is it just doesn't work. It not only just it takes an enormous amount of time and effort, but students are incredibly discerning. Like when I first started making online videos, even in like 2011 and 12, students would complain that people on YouTube were better than me, because they have a mass amount of time to do video production and graphics, animation. Or I had one comment on a course review about why aren't my graphics as good as National Geographic, where that, so, here's an example, and I'm not down on this one colleague. He's trying really hard, but they've spent a fortune trying to make this world for a geoscience toolkit. And you can see there's very low resolution. It's an empty landscape. You really can't engage in detailed science measurements, and it's just not holding the students' attention. So the alternative is to turn to what are called AAA video games. AAA is a reference in video games referring to something that has blockbuster breadth and depth of content, a Marvel movie scale of budget, generally $50 to $300 million being spent to make a game, compared to a professor and a technician working away and, on something on their own. And then these are all going to gross easily over $1 billion. So just as two examples, Assassin's Creed has made some very stunning recreations of historic environments, from Paris to ancient Egypt to more recently the Greek islands, and then a recreation of a dystopian Seattle in The Last of Us Part 2. Like just stunning amount of detail, attention to architecture, culture, clothing, just all sorts of things. And in particular, I've been particularly intrigued by this game called Red Dead Redemption 2, which in my opinion is far and away the best of what's ever been made for aiming for realism. It was released in 2018. It's on Windows, it's on Xbox and PlayStation. It cost $540 million to produce, although about half of that was in marketing. But even still, $250 million over 8 years, having thousands of artists and engineers and computer programmers recreating this Wild West world circa about 1890. They've sold over 43 million copies. And today you can get the game, for like $20. So but originally sold for like 65. And here's just one example, a historic photo of a place in Mississippi that they recreated. And it's not intended to be a perfect recreation, but it has all of the same level of detail as reality, that people are using this game to teach classes in clothing and cultural styles and architecture. They've done laser scans of buildings throughout New Orleans as another example. And for me, since I'm working on the environment, it's just been really stunning how in recent years, video game developers have been undertaking laser scans all over the world. They send a team to a part of the world, either with really intensive photography abilities or with these laser scanners. And they, in this case, for example, Cumberland Falls in the US was fully scanned and then just brought in wholesale into the game, then dropped into the setting. And this is a relatively low graphics rendition I pulled off from online, but it's stunning in its accuracy and the geological and hydrological features that are there. And when you step back and you look at landscapes, like I've been to some scientific conferences among river scientists, and I'll ask, I'll give you I hold up a $5 bill. I'll give you $5 if you can tell me where in the US this photo was taken. And people genuinely try. We're talking about world-class river scientists, and they cannot tell you that this isn't a real river. And similarly, here's another setting of a mountain meadow. We have lots of these mountain meadows in the Sierras, and they are a big management problem. So there's a remarkable amount of possibility here. So in the peak of the pandemic for winter 2021, that first really big peak we had, I created a 1-unit trial course. Something I'd been working towards for a while, and I finally sort of released this into the wild. So the idea is to learn like the same kind of things that I would do in a field trip, but now undertake them in the Red Dead Redemption 2 video game. That was the goal. And so I had specific learning objectives for like we would do for any class. So I wanted them to be able to analyze a river using expert judgment and quantitative measures, so integrating critical thinking and just going out and measuring things. And yes, you can measure things in these video games. And so being able to do valley classification, river classification, habitat analysis, teaching them how to do surveying, like full topographic surveying, and describing the landforms and attributes of the river in different ways. And I'll even show you having them carry out a full U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wetland delineation workflow. So each week I would pick one topic, and in the lead up to that topic, I'd spend many hours finding the best locations. The video game has a vast world that you can explore by horseback, or if you're on you can play this game either on your own computer, or you can play it in a community-based multiplayer setting. On your own computer, you can modify the game. Like you can break the game by adding more tools. Like you can fly around like a superhero and see whatever you want from the air. And that was a very powerful tool for helping them to explore different areas. So we worked through a number of different topics, some more basic science, some very, very applied. I mean, if I was running a field trip, one of the things about Davis is we're so far from everything, other than just Puda Creek, it's an hour to here and 2 hours to there. And so we're generally in a region with a lot of things, but I wouldn't be able to get students to do all of the variety of things that we could do here. And in some cases, things that would not be safe to go and do, but we could do there. So in the very first class meeting, we met in the Red Dead online multiplayer arena. Each student has to purchase the game. They have to have a PC that can run the game and set it up accordingly. Students made choices about how much time they wanted to spend in the game, if they want to have different clothing or guns or hats or whatever they want. That's sort of up to them. A 50-minute class seemed to have 2 day and night cycles. So we might start off at night and then, go day, night, day. And so we would all take out our lanterns in the game and start off with discussion and reading notes. We can all talk just time. And at the same time that we're doing this, I'm on Zoom. I'm recording the whole thing on Zoom. So if somebody's away from their computer or something's not working, I say, you know what, don't worry about that right now. Watch the class on Zoom and you can go into the game later and look at those different things. So for this first class meeting, I picked a really small river, kind of like, let's start with baby steps. It's a nice little creek. It's got some cool features because besides the wetted area, they've remarkably gone through and delineated what I would call a bankful channel, which is the transition from the frequently wetted area that has less vegetation or only water happy vegetation to the surrounding soil. And so I would use the Socratic method. I'd say, oh, well, what is a bankful channel? Everybody, I want you to walk to where you think the top of the bank is. And you can see like this person thinks the bank is here and this person's here and this person's there. And so they've spread around. And then while they're standing there, we could talk about, well, why do you think it's here? Why do you think it's there? So the full Socratic method, no different than what I would do if I was in a real world field trip to the McElney River or something. And the wetland delineation thing was the most remarkable thing. Like we could go to this wetland, there's many of them in the game, but we went to this one that I really liked. All of the plants, like each individual plant is a real plant that I could find on a list of like, it's this kind of vegetation. And so I had them go around and identify all of the different plant species that were in here that were typically identified as wetland plants. I had them map the proportion of the area that would be considered wetland and the areas of these different plants. And then on the left, we had open the real spreadsheet that's used by the Army Corps of Engineers And so on the left, I'd have that open. On the right, we'd have our game. And then they would have to go through. So we would do a 1 hour introduction. And then as their homework assignment, they would have to now work in pairs or individually and go through the full quantitative process of assessing whether this is in fact a real wetland. That was the biggest surprise of what we were able to do. We also did a really fun pollution assessment project. So there's a place in the world where there's a mine, and you can see this orange water here. There's what's called acid mine drainage that comes out of this mine through a cave system out onto the landscape, and then it pollutes a whole lake, and the frogs are all like hopping weird and look strange. And then it goes into the river. So then on the left, I had created like a workflow of things they could do. And so we did a 1 hour reconning class, and then I gave them a bunch of tasks to how to study this acid mine drainage problem, which they did, and then they wrote it up. So some of the responses that we got was from a couple of different students. Okay, I certainly appreciated the class lecturers. Basically, like this was a great opportunity. Let's just walk around with the professor and talk. You know, like that was a great thing that they liked. I actually had a student who was a first-year student, hadn't even taken any other prerequisites, but for them, that was a really good introduction to things. They were able to get through it pretty reasonably and enjoyed the class. And people talked about not only learning concepts, but carrying out real world assignments that they would learn. Now, everything I've said is positive, but let's face the fact, there's some very, very difficult questions and realities that go into this choice. I was extraordinarily lucky on two fronts. First, nothing went as bad as it easily could have. And second, the students took everything in stride when something did happen. So so the first issue is an issue of equity. Now, field trips already have problems with equity that are hard to deal with, but even more, well, I would just say, again, the same like in here. So students, they have to be able to afford or have a powerful Windows computer. You can't just have a Mac or a Chromebook. Now, the way I worked around it is if they had a computer that wasn't going to work, I allowed them to just watch on Zoom rather than being there in person. And they could, although because of the pandemic, they couldn't like go over to someone's house, but they could set up a Zoom with a friend and then work together over Zoom while that person was playing the game to do what they needed to do. So there's still some financial differences here. Of course, some students are very well versed in video games. I had some students who'd never played a video game before. Like, I mean, maybe they'd done something on their phone, but never like an open world AAA video game. And so I'm happy to give them more tutoring and experience and practice in that. I wrote detailed workflows for how to set everything up so that making sure everybody knew what they needed. But the problem is that since we're meeting in a multiplayer world where there's thousands of people who could be in that same server at any one time, there is a high risk of being trolled. I mean, one time when I dropped into the world about 10 minutes before class, and I needed to, because you have to ride your horse. So I had to ride my horse to where the class was meeting. It was like, I figured it would be about a 10-minute horse ride. And, I was attacked and people were saying horrible things. And they killed me. And I just didn't say anything. I just let them kill me and move on. You can actually designate yourself as a non-combatant, basically. And if somebody kills a non-combatant, then it negatively impacts them. But there's a lot of things they can do besides actually killing you. So two of my students were working on their wetland delineation, and a whole group of people came up to them, picked them up, threw them on the ground, and hogtied them and left. So, this is like some of the issues that can come up when you're playing in a setting. Now, ideally, this could be defeated. Like, we could fix this if only I could get in touch with the company that makes and runs the game and say, hey, can I have a server? Can you just set aside a server for certain hours? We could drop our class in and not have anyone else in the server in that period of time. But so far, I haven't been able to get in touch with somebody to make that happen. And then similarly, games, while you can have thousands of people in any one server, there can be many servers concurrently. So when a student goes into a game, or I go into a game, how do you know you're going to end up in the same server? Red Dead Redemption has a mechanism where you can bring together a group. I think it's limited. It's either 6 or 8 people that you can come together. And early in the pandemic, I read articles about companies that were getting together in Red Dead at campsites rather than meeting on Zoom as just another way to have a friendly environment to work. So I started off with a class of about 12 people. I think a lot of people were curious about it, but then they dropped off because like other workload was more important and this wasn't the high priority as one unit. So I ended up with like 8 students. A couple of people just did it on Zoom, and then the others came into the game. But again, like working with the company, if we could get our own server, then we wouldn't face that kind of limitation. So I think there's things to work through, but I really did enjoy it. I haven't decided whether I'm going to run it again or in what context, but I thought it was successful, and I'm going to keep my eye on as more games come out, what they can do.